We assume that we know why we do what we do. When we look at our lives and we think about the choices that we make, the decisions that we go through, we think that we know why we make the decisions and do the things that we do. That we look at ourselves and we can say, I believe that this action is good, so I'm going to do that. I believe that that choice is bad, so I'm not going to do that. That would be a bad decision, so I'm going to stay away from that. That's a good decision. I'm going to go after it. And it's easy to break life into categories of right and wrong, black, white, better, best, yes, and no. And as Christians, this is even more so for us because we carry around a book with us that lays out rules for living. It tells us ways to act, and it's easy for us to look at the Bible and to say, this is good, I'm going to do that. This is bad, I'm not going to do that. And that's how I live my life. That's how I make the decisions that I make throughout my day. And so, why is it hard if we've got a book that tells us about how to live and what to do? Why is it so hard for us to always make the right decisions or to do the right things in our mind or to do what we feel like we know we're supposed to do? As Paul talks about the good that I know that I ought to do, this I do not do. But the good I know, or what I know I should not do, that I keep doing. That's at war in our brains. So why do we have this hard time? And if we have a book that tells us what we're supposed to do, what are we to think when someone else views that book differently than we do? Or furthermore, if somebody who has that book as a standard in their lives thinks very differently about things that you think are very clear and black and white. How can people act so differently than me if we're reading the same book? How do I respond to that? What do I do? What should I think about that? And yet, how do we also, going further down this road, how do we think about people who do what it says and seem to do so well? And we think to ourselves, I'm doing the same thing they're doing. How come they seem to be so much ahead of me? There's people that we can look at through our history, and we can look at people like Dr. Martin Luther King, and we can say, he's an amazing man. But he and I believe in the same God, and we believe the same things. Why was he so influential? That he led the civil rights movement. And surely he wasn't the only person who went through the struggles of a pre-civil rights life in America. And he wasn't the only great speaker. So what did he do that was so different than something I do or something that somebody else does? What makes him successful? How about Mother Teresa? Someone who's known around the world for taking care of people and loving people and serving the poor. We do that. Why is she known around the world for her compassion and for her love for other people? What's different about her? If we look at somebody a little bit more closer to home, how about a Mary Thurman? Known around the city and honored for the work that she does in taking care of people. That she's one of us. What did she do differently? What was different about the way that she thought and would make her choices? There seems to be something at play. When we look at all of these people, whether it's great people like Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa or one of our own like Mary Thurman, there's a pattern of thought that determines how people act, how they think, and how they behave. Author and speaker Simon Sinek describes it this way. He comes up with what he calls the golden circle, which probably many of us have heard about. He talks about what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. And he calls this the golden circle. Now, just to kind of look at some of these terms, all of us know the things that we do. We know the what. We know what we do in our lives. We know the things that we do here in the church. Most of us know how we do it. But when we get to why, that tends to be the fuzziest part. But it's what drives each one of these people that we've talked about. Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Mary Thurman, and as we're going to look at, Jesus. Within each one of us, we have our own set of ideals, our own why at the center of how we think and how we view the world. And it determines which things we prioritize in our lives, the things that we enjoy, where we find worth and value, both in life and in ourselves. And it's this set of internal beliefs, this why, that shapes the kind of people that we are. So if you're a musical person, you probably have a belief that creating music adds beauty to the world. That's a why, that's a belief, and that's going to carry itself out, and you're going to create music. If you're an athletic or a sporty kind of person, you probably have a belief about the value of competition, the value of health and wellness and working with others to accomplish a goal. If you're highly organized, there's probably a part of you within you that feels the need to exert control over your environment. That's definitely me. That the people that we are, this centerpiece drives so much about what we do. David, you mind if we go back a slide? So when we think about these things, these are important parts of who we are. And if we're not able to tap into our why, into these aspects of our character, it can make us feel unsettled or feel like something's missing. And you might not even know why, but you feel like something's off. And I think that's why COVID and quarantines have been so difficult for so many of us, is because I can't do the things with other people, or I can't get out and do the same activities that I'm used to doing, that I'm missing my why here. But I believe that the most inspired people, the most inspired organizations, whether that's a company, whether that's a church, that they have a clear understanding of why they exist. What is their purpose? What are they doing? And they think from the inside out. Most of us think from the outside in because it's the easiest way. So if we think about our church, there's many things that we do, the whats. When you think about the Columbia Church, and I'm going to ask you for your input here in a second, what kinds of things do we do? What is our what? When you think about our church, what do we do? What's something that we do? We pray. We volunteer in the community. We reach out. We make disciples. We come to church. We read our Bibles. That these are the whats. These are the easy things that we look at and we say, what makes the Columbia Church, what makes it up? What kinds of things do we do? How do we work? And how does our church work? Most of us know how we do that. What kinds of things, how do we organize our church is a little bit less clear though. We've got family groups, and so we do some working with our family groups throughout the week. We do midweeks. We have discipling partners. We sort of facilitate relationships through one-on-one relationships. This is our how. But why do we do what we do? When we get back to why does that happen? Why do we come to midweek every week? Why do we pray? Why do we read our Bible? Why do we have family groups? That question can be a little less clear. And many of us have different ideas. And if I went around and asked you, why do we do what we do? You probably have different opinion. But we tend to think from the outside in, and it tends to show up in many different ways. So when we think about how we talk about ourselves, we tend to talk about ourselves when we're sharing our faith or evangelizing. So would you agree with me or not that this might be an example of a way that we tend to share our faith? So let's go to the next slide, please. So you might go up to someone and you say, hey, I go to this great church. We have all kinds of folks from families and singles, teens, college kids, empty nesters, blacks, whites, Latinx, young, old. It's great. We have dynamic services on Sunday, and we meet in small groups during the week to help us create a sense of family. And the best part is that we all live out the Bible. Want to come? This feels like the way that I tend to share my faith, that this is working from the outside in, though. And is it appealing? Is there something different that makes us different? People could listen to this and they might be swayed, they might be engaged, or they might not. Let's look at our website for a second. This is what our website tells us. So it says that our mission is that we want to live out the kingdom through having perfect communion with God so that our characters can be transformed. And we can ultimately bear the fruit of God's kingdom in both our faith community and in the community of the city around us. And so I don't want to knock this at all. This is the why piece is actually spelled out really well on our website, but this piece kind of jumped out. And that this spells out our what and our how. But it doesn't hit at the why. Do you know why we do what we do? Do you know why you do what you do? So I've been talking about this guy, Simon Sinek, and he wrote a book called Start With Why. And he says that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. That people want to know why a company exists. They want to know why a person is doing what they're doing. And that's what inspires people. And when we know why, it can shape everything else. And it can shape how we view someone. Jesus, as we're going to look at, was very clear about his why, his purpose, why he came. And when we look at his why, we can see direct correlations between all of his actions and all of his decisions. And so if you can understand the why, you can understand and it makes sense out of all the other pieces. And if we don't know why we do something, if we don't know why we exist or what our purpose is, that when we start to look at the what's and those tangible pieces, it's very easy for us to get split into little pockets. And you and I disagree on this and that. We have to get back to the why, the purpose of our faith. What was Jesus' purpose? What was his why? And because we know what Jesus' purpose was, we're much more comfortable accepting things from him no matter what it was, because we're inspired by that purpose. We're inspired by him. And so we are willing to accept anything that he talks about, whether it's loving the poor, because we know that that's part of his character. We're okay with hearing about faith and prayer, because not only do we see him do it, but we know that it's a part of his purpose. But we also are willing to accept him when he talks about money. For a man who didn't have any, we're willing to accept and listen to a message about how to take care of our money. We're willing to accept a teaching from Jesus about our marriage from a man who was never married, because Jesus talked about his why. He talked about, this is who I am, and this is what is important to me. And so we're going to look at Jesus. We're going to see how he defined his why and how it guided everything else that he did. And we're going to start by looking in the book of Luke. So go ahead and turn over to the book of Luke, please. And of all the Gospels, Luke is the one that's written by the man Luke, known to be a doctor or supposed to be a doctor. He was a traveling partner with Paul. And listen to Paul. He never met Jesus, but by meeting other people, by building up his stories and gathering stories together, that he was able to build his own narrative of the life of Jesus. And as we're going to see, the life of Jesus that he painted is unique from the other Gospels in the things that he chose to bring out. And the thing that he highlights throughout his gospel is that he's focused on people outside of the regular Jewish community. In fact, his gospel starts with 4 different stories He starts with telling us about a poor, unmarried girl who is called to have a baby out of wedlock that came from God, but was going to be the Messiah. That he brought this to this young, unmarried, poor girl. He tells us about John the Baptist, a man who was physically removed from the community and isolated himself outside of the community preaching. He also tells us that Jesus' birth was first announced to a group of shepherds, poor, dirty, living on the outskirts of society, shepherds. And then in chapter 4, we get to Jesus introducing himself. Luke has introduced him. We see John introduce him when he goes to be baptized. And in chapter 4, we get to our fourth story. And Jesus begins his kingdom mission by going home, and he goes to Galilee, and he goes to the temple. And we read in Luke chapter 4, in verse 14, it says that Jesus came down from the mountains from being tempted by the devil, and he returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. And news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. Verse 16, he went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and pulling it up on his iPad, he found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And so the verse that Jesus uses to launch his ministry is this verse out of Isaiah 61, where Jesus says, let me read this to you. This is fulfilled today. As you are hearing it, this describes who I am, and this is going to define me. And so what's this verse saying? Well, if we look at how Jesus introduces himself and what he says in all the other Gospels, that all the Gospels portray Jesus as the Messianic King bringing the good news of God's kingdom. We looked at that last month. When Jesus came, the first thing that he said is, the time is near, repent and believe the kingdom of God is near, repent and believe the good news. But here in Luke, he highlights the social implications of Jesus' mission. So 2 times in this verse, as we lost our signal, that's okay. 2 times in this verse, Jesus refers to freedom. That he says, I'm going to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and freedom for the oppressed. 2 times he uses the word freedom. And the Greek word that he uses is one that could be translated as a release. And what it actually is referring back to is the year of Jubilee. In Leviticus 25, God said, all right, Israel, you are freed from Egypt. Let me give you some rules of how to live. One of the things I want you to do is every 7 times 7 years, remember we talk about rhythms and everything throughout the Old Testament, 7 times 7 is 49. So every 49th year, I want you to have what's called a year of Jubilee. And during this year, you're going to free the prisoners. You're going to free the slaves. You're going to return land that was taken back to families. That it's going to be a time of renewal, a time of returning to the way that things should be. That I understand that things are going to kind of get messy for a time, but every 49 years, you need to have a year of Jubilee, and there will be freedom for the prisoners, freedom for the oppressed. And Jesus says that this is who I am, that I want you to remember this. I want you to remember this time of Jubilee. And Jesus looks at the rest of the people and he says, I'm here to offer good news to the poor. I'm here to offer recovery of sight for the blind and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That Jesus starts by highlighting different groups of people outside of the Jewish community that he said, my kingdom and what I'm about is really good for these people who are oppressed. This is my why. This is what I'm about. And Luke, as we turn the page and we look at the next things that Jesus does, is he starts to have interactions outside the community with people that aren't Jews, that aren't the religious people, that he doesn't get in front of people and say, let me teach you. He says, let me go and interact with people and let me offer freedom for prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind. And there are 6 different kinds of people that Jesus has interactions with immediately after this. First is the poor, as he talked about in this verse, in verse 18. The poor would be people not only who have a lack of money, but it would be people who are outside of their own ability to care for themselves. That would include widows, it would include orphans, not simply people without money. That these would be the kinds of people that it would be very easy for others to look at as seeing them as an unfortunate burden on society. When I look at a poor person, that person is a burden to me. And I consider them to be lazy or undeserving of what I've worked hard to earn. We can see remnants of this still today, of the poor being people that are outside of the way that we take care of other people. And Jesus said, this is important to me. That the poor doesn't have to be merely those who don't have money. It can be anyone who has to rely on others. It can be those with fragile health during this time of COVID. It can be shut-ins. That the poor can be all kinds of people who have to rely on others. The second group that he looks at are sinners. And sinners, as Jesus interacts with people, you see all kinds of people. People who are living lives that are outside of what we would expect, what you and I would expect as righteous or godly or moral lives. That he interacts with prostitutes. And that he has feasts with people that would be considered drunkards. That they were seen as being beyond the possibility of redemption. That because they didn't observe the law, I don't want to have anything to do with them. And in fact, they're deserving of God's coming judgment. Those are the people that Jesus spent time with outside the community. The third group would be tax collectors that he spent time with. That these people were seen as, they're one of me, but they're collecting money to give to this foreign occupying power. So you're greedy and you're betraying your own people. You are despicable. Those are the people that Jesus spent time with and interacted with. He interacted with Romans, abusers, and foreigners who were illegally living in Israel. That when people looked at the Romans, they were hated. You don't belong here. Why are you here? You shouldn't be here. This is our land. You need to go back where you came from. And Jesus didn't regard any of them that way. And in fact, when we look at at accounts of how Jesus interacted with Romans, that in Matthew 8, verse 10, a centurion comes up and talks to Jesus and says, hey, I need you to heal my servant. And how does Jesus respond to him? It says he was amazed by his faith, and he turns to the crowd and he says, I've never seen faith like this in all of Israel. That this one that you hate, this one that you want out so badly, makes you look terrible. And Jesus was amazed at his faith. Somebody that the rest of the crowd said, we don't want them here. Send them away. Get them out. I hope as I'm going through this, you're hearing modern equivalents. The fifth group that he interacted with were Samaritans. And Samaritans, as many of us know, were hated by the Jews. That they lived in a land just north of Israel, And what had happened was, in years past, the Babylonians had come in, they'd conquered all of the land of Israel and Judah, and they had sent everybody back to Babylon to take them out. But what they also did is they said, we're going to send some of our own people back to that land and populate it so it's not just empty. So when the exile happened, it wasn't like just empty land, that it was repopulated by Babylonians. And they intermarried with the Jews who had been left. And so they created this cross sort of homogenous group that was not Jewish at all. And in fact, they had started to worship other gods. They weren't worshiping in the temple, that they had turned their backs on the cleanliness that we Jews prioritize and hold so dear. And they became hated by the Jews. And the Samaritans in Luke's gospel are so important that Luke devotes 9 chapters of his gospel to tell a story about Jesus going through the land of Samaria and interacting with people through there. That Jews of that day, as many of us know, would avoid Samaria altogether. And Jesus said, not only am I going to go through Samaria, I'm going to spend a lot of time in Samaria, the home of the enemy, of the enemies of the Jews, the home of the Jews' enemies. There we go. And this was radical to even the people who were following Jesus, because they didn't understand his why. They didn't understand why he was doing what he did. And so the very first encounter that Jesus and his followers have with Samaritans is in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. Luke chapter 9, verse 51. It says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. The word that it says that Jesus did was it to rebuke his disciples, the people following him. The other times that the word rebuke, that this Greek word is used in the New Testament, it's used to describe when Jesus would cast out a demon. So Jesus looks at his followers, the men who have pledged their lives to follow him, and he said, that attitude that you have towards your enemy, that's demonic. It needs to get out of here. And he rebuked them the same way that he would rebuke an evil spirit. That the demonic spirit of self-righteous condemnation must be cast out of his disciples. The demonic spirit of self-righteous condemnation must be cast out of his disciples. And even the followers of Jesus were convinced that some don't belong, but not Jesus. Jesus said, it's important for us to be here, and I want you to go ahead of me and interact with people. And they're not going to love you. Some will, but not all of them. And when they respond negatively, he says, for your attitude of getting rid of them, that's demonic. That's the first encounter with the Samaritans. The second encounter is right after that. You turn the page, and in Luke 10, verses 1 through 9, Jesus says, all right, I'm going to send you out. I want you to go spread the word and tell people about me and about the good news, and go out into the villages. And he says to them to put yourselves among them. Eat their food. Stay in their homes. Not only are you not to hate them, but I want you to be mingled with them, integrated with them. It doesn't mean you have to become what they are, but it does mean that you have to love them, that you have to show them compassion, that they're not these unclean people that we have to fear, that these are people that we need to go and we need to love, that we need to serve, that we need to take care of. and I want you to go and I want you to live with them for a time. Eat their food. It's going to be different. Talk with them. Get to know their kids. Where are they from? How did they end up here? What are they doing? What's their lives like? You can't just assume that you know everything about these people because they carry some kind of label of where they're from. Compassion. And we get these echoes of Jeremiah's call for the exiled Israelites. So in Jeremiah, the whole prophecy, the first part of it, Jeremiah is saying to Israel, hey, look, you guys got to get with the program here. God's going to cast you out, and it happens. And they're exiled, and everybody is looking back to Jerusalem, weeping and saying, this is awful. We want to go back. We were wrong. We're horrible. We're sorry. And Jeremiah writes a letter, and he sends it to the elders of the people who are exiled. And he says, don't go anywhere. Stay. Settle down. Pray for these people. Pray for their peace. Let your peace, let your shalom rest on them. That we get the same echoes here when Jesus tells his disciples to go amongst the people in Samaria. And these chapters, this group of 9 chapters where Jesus and his disciples are wandering through Samaria, that they include some of Jesus' most well-known stories and teachings. The parable of the prodigal son. As we read through that, we get an invitation to the older brother, who would be the Jews, to enter into a celebration with the younger brother, the Samaritans. And the father comes out and he's pleading with the older brother and he says, come, this is a party for everyone. I don't know if you got a chance to watch Marty Solomon's lesson on Shalom, but everyone's invited to the party. And the father has to come out and he has to talk to the son and he says, join us. This is for everybody. And the story puts out this invitation, and the story ends with no answer, with the question of how are the Jews going to respond? How are we going to respond to the people that we view as our enemies? We don't use those words, but there are definitely the people that we feel uncomfortable by. There are the people that might carry a label. I know what that person or those people are going to be like. I can just imagine how this is going to go. That we've already got these suppositions in our heads, that these are prejudices. And it's not just about racial prejudice. It's absolutely that. But as Marty Solomon talked about, that we can get a prejudice about when we serve. And I'm so great and the poor is so lucky to have me here taking care of them. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Join the party. So the Samaritans played a special role in Luke's gospel. The 6th group that Luke continues to point out is women. That women had a special place in Luke's gospel. He provides information about countless women. He tells stories about them and details about Mary, the mother of Jesus, about this prophetess, Anna, who blesses Jesus when he's brought to the temple as a baby. Mary and Martha play a large role in the Gospels. That Luke praised the Queen of Sheba's faith, and he used women as examples of faithfulness in many of his stories. That the main heroine or the main character was a woman. 3 verses in the beginning of chapter 8 talk about the women that followed Jesus and the fact that they provided much of Jesus' financial backing. That Jesus obviously needed money to travel, he needed money for food. Many women were the ones that backed him and helped him be able to facilitate that in the beginning of chapter 8. There's many stories about Jesus resurrecting a widow's son. Talks about Jairus' daughter, healing Jairus' daughter. And one of my favorite stories, this is actually in Mark 5, Jesus heals the bleeding woman. And I love it because he says to her after she reaches out and she touches his cloak and says, if I can just touch him, I'll be healed. And he looks around for her and he finds her and he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Go in peace. Go in shalom. What does shalom mean? It means complete. He tells her, you are whole. That you were broken before and you've been made whole. Go in peace. Go in shalom. I love that. Man, I got like teary-eyed thinking about just this amazing interaction. Another thing with that woman is that in the law, it talked about if you're bleeding, that you're considered ceremonially unclean. And so you need to kind of remove yourself. And here comes someone into the midst of the crowd who is ceremonially unclean. And what does she do? She reaches and she touches the master. And Jesus casts her away from him, pushes her away and says, I can't believe you made me unclean. Not at all. In compassion, he bends down and he says, you're healed, that you're whole. He doesn't care that all of a sudden he's ceremonially unclean now. He says, you're the priority. You are my why. You're why I do what I do. Why do I live this way? It's because of you. It's for you. I want you to have peace. I want you to find shalom. That Jesus not only interacts with these people outside of the community, but he includes them in his community. And Luke is constantly emphasizing this idea and the theme of inclusion. This does not mean that Jesus condoned sin. This does not mean that, hey, you can be with me and you can be anything that you want. No. Jesus said, I love you for you. And that he didn't put rules on who can come to him. Jesus confronted sin. Let's not be unclear about that. Jesus confronted sin. But he didn't put up any walls. He welcomed people with open arms. And throughout Luke's story, it's actually the male Jews who most often misunderstood Jesus' commitment to diversity. He had to tell it to his disciples. He had to tell it to the Jewish leaders who came to him and said, what are you doing? And Jesus said, you obviously know nothing about me. My why, my purpose is to take care of people and to bring them freedom and healing and resurrection. That bringing shalom is my why. That Jesus showed again and again and again that he would go anywhere, meet with anyone, eat with anyone, in order to convey God's unconditional acceptance and bringing them healing transformation. And I think the reason why this theme is so prevalent in Luke's gospel is that Luke himself was an outsider. As a Gentile, Luke had to ask himself again and again, do I belong? Is it okay for me to be here? And he had to keep returning again and again to these stories and go, yes, he wants me here. I remember how he treated the bleeding woman. I remember how he treated the prostitutes. I remember how he treated the Samaritans. I remember how he treated the Romans. I belong. And it gave him confidence, and it gave Luke encouragement because of Jesus' why, because of his purpose. Let's look at a teaching of Jesus. Let's look at a teaching. Are we doing okay? All right, I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure I'm sensitive to the time. So let's turn over to Matthew 25. I'm going to try and pick up the speed a little bit. Matthew 25, verse 14. All right. Okay, this is called the parable of the talents, or in some Bibles it says the parable of the bags of gold. Chapter 25, Matthew 25, verse 14. That's close, not chapter 9, though. It says in verse 14, again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, verse 19, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Verse 22, the man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Verse 24, then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has been given more, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, this is a heavy verse for Jesus to talk about because the portrayal of God is a pretty negative sounding one. Would you not agree? Sounds tough. And it starts out in verse 14. Again, it will be like a man. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven. What is it going to be like to be in the kingdom of heaven? And so this is a portrayal of what Jesus came to bring. So if you think back to our introductory lesson about shalom, we talked about shalom stewardship. And we looked at the moment that God placed mankind in the garden. And God places them in the garden and he tells them to be fruitful and multiply. And he tells them exactly how to do that. And he tells them with four words. He says, I want you to subdue it, which means I want you to take it and make it work for you. He says, I want you to rule over it. Don't let it conquer you. That there's this element of God saying, I'm putting you in charge of my garden. So don't let this thing rise up and conquer you. Rule over the garden. He says to serve the land. He says to avad, to serve the land. Give the land what it needs. That the land needs your attention. And you need to put in the effort. You need to put in the work to help the land fulfill the potential that I gave to it. The goodness is in there, but it needs you. And the fourth term that God gives to man and woman when he puts them in the garden is he says to take care of the land, to shamar the land. It's like looking over a small child, guarding and protecting it and preserving it. All right, so keep that in our mind. Back to the parable. So who are our characters? We've got the master. He's the one in charge. That he's the one who gave out the money. So the money wasn't necessarily earned by the workers per se, but the master decided to give it out. Okay, that's one character, is the master. The other character are the servants. They work for the master. They're invited by the master to care for what the master has. And the master takes from what he has, and he invites the servants to care for it. The servants work at the pleasure of the master, but the master gives them incredible trust and opportunity. He doesn't tell them what to do necessarily. He just says, you're in charge of this. Take care of it. I think from the beginning part of this, the master sounds like a pretty gracious dude. Taking care of the servants, giving them what they hadn't worked for, what they hadn't earned, and he puts them in charge of it and says, I put it in your hands. So he entrusts his wealth to his servants, and he goes away for some amount of time and returns to see how they've handled what he'd given them. And the master assesses what they've done, and he uses 2 words to describe his servants. The first 2 he described as faithful. He said, you were responsible with what I gave you, and I define that as faith. You took care of what I gave you, and I define that as faith. That I could trust you, that you were with me. You knew the kind of person that I was, and you worked to enhance what I'd given to you. That you respected what I'd given you. You respected me because of I gave this to you, you took care of it, you improved upon it. That shows care and respect for me. And I call that faithful. The other word that he used to describe his servants, the one who didn't do anything with the money, was wicked. Wow, that's a strong word to be called wicked. So why? Why would he call him wicked? Lazy, I get. Why wicked? Well, do you remember the term that we used in the first lesson for the opposite of shalom? Is the term ra. It means chaos, evil, and wickedness. So the master is saying that you and what I'm seeing in you is raw. There's evil, wickedness, chaos in you. When we do not faithfully and responsibly handle what we've been given, whether that's a garden like in Genesis, a bag of money like here in Matthew, or an apartment or a job like today, that when we do not faithfully and responsibly handle what we've been given, God sees that as an unraveling or a pulling apart of shalom and introducing chaos into his world. But why? Why does he see that? Remember that before God put his hand to ordering the world, in the very first couple lines of Genesis, that before God had done anything, that it described the world as tohu vavohu, this wild chaos, this wild nothingness, that it was chaotic waters. And it wasn't until God set about bringing order to the world that order did appear, that God had to bring order to the world. And so apart from God, there is chaos and there is ra. So think about it this way. What happens to a garden if you don't take care of it? The grass gets long, vines start growing up into the trees and they choke the plants, the flowers wither, the fruit rots on the branches, insects and animals take over the space. It overtakes you, and the order unravels. And God is not a God of disorder, but a God of order. So, here's the point. When you stop working and caring for what God places in your hands, disorder and chaos appear. You are allowing, and in some cases promoting, an existence outside the presence of God. That's why it is wicked. Doesn't that mean so much more and make so much more sense than simply hearing that God wants us to be responsible? That shalom answers the question why. That when we consider what did Jesus do, that he brought shalom. And he worked for the good of people who needed him. And he teaches us to do the same thing, and we could see it through parables. So whether we're looking at his actions or listening to his words, he's saying the same thing. That I, Jesus, am here to bring back that world that God had intended from the beginning. And it's going to look different in different ways. I'm bringing healing for the broken. I'm bringing life to those who are dead. I'm bringing sight to the blind, freedom to the prisoners. That's the world that I'm bringing. That's my purpose. That's my why. That drives everything else that I do. As we continue to talk in the coming months, we're going to look at decisions that we have to be making as individuals, as family groups, as families, as a church. Things that will populate kind of that what circle. But that will mean nothing, and we'll disagree over everything if we don't have our why on straight. If we don't understand why we do what we do. Why do you live that way? If you don't know, nothing else is going to matter. Nothing's going to make sense, and we're going to be divided if we're not unified on that one thing. Our why is incredibly important to how we survive and how we will flourish as people and as a church. I want to finish up with two examples that aren't in the Bible. One is a man named Samuel Pierpont Langley. Most people have not heard of Samuel Pierpont Langley, but in the early 20th century, the thing was this idea of flight. How can I create a flying machine? That's what everybody was endeavoring to do and to accomplish. And Samuel Pierpont Langley was the man who was going to do it. That he was intelligent, that he worked for the Smithsonian, that he had a seat at Harvard, that he taught at the astronomy department at the University of Pittsburgh, that he was connected to the most well-connected people. He had $50,000 given to him by the War Department to figure out this flying machine. The New York Times reported on all his work and his pursuit to build the flying machine. So why haven't we heard of him? Because in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, completely different than Samuel Pierpont Langley. They were poor. They were owners of a bike shop. That no one on their team had a college education. They were not the educated group. But they had a belief that drove what they did. That if they could figure out how to make a machine fly, that it could change the course of history and change the world. And so, Langley, on the other hand, wanted to be rich, and he wanted to be famous. And he was in pursuit of the result. That it wasn't driven by his why, it wasn't driven from his passion. He was in pursuit of that carrot to be rich and to be famous. And then on December 17th, 1903, Orville and Wilbur, poor brothers, succeeded in flying a machine. And proof that Langley was only about the results, as soon as he heard that the Wrights had successfully flown, he quit. He hung it all up. I'm done. And he moved on to other pursuits. He wasn't rich. He didn't become famous. He didn't win. And as soon as he heard that somebody else had done it, he said, all right, I'm out of here. He could have gone and he could have said, that's amazing. Let me help you. I've got money. I've got resources. I've got people. And he said, nope, I'm done. It was not his purpose. And you don't know who Samuel Pierpont Langley is because of that. We could have been reading about him all our lives, but he turned away because it wasn't his why. How about someone who did believe? In the summer of 1963, 250,000 people showed up on the mall of the Lincoln Memorial to listen to Dr. Martin Luther King speak. No invitations were sent, and no website existed to check the dates. How does that happen? How do you get 250,000 people to show up on the right day and the right time? Well, Martin Luther King wasn't the only great speaker of that time. But when he talked, he spoke in a different way, and he focused not on what needed to change. He talked about that clearly, but he focused on what he believed. I believe. Here's what I believe. And it influenced everything else that he said. And people who believed what he believed took his cause, made it their own, and they went and they told people. And some people who believed what he believed, they created structures to get the word out to more people. And sure enough, 250,000 people showed up at the right day, at the right time to hear him speak. But how many people came because they heard that Martin Luther King is speaking? Not many. Not many. They showed up for themselves because he spoke about what they believed about America, that his why had become their why. And it changed who they were and what they did. They did it for themselves and that's why that they rode on buses for 8 hours to Washington, D.C. to stand outside under the hot August sun to listen to a man speak. Martin Luther King believed that there are two kinds of laws in the world, the laws of God and the laws of man. And not until the laws of man align with the laws of God will there be justice in the world. He inspired people because of what he believed. And a couple of days ago, we honored him and we had activities and we still do things that because of his belief, because he held on to his why, we look at him and we say, I'm inspired to be a better version of myself. I'm inspired to love people. And we do the same thing with Jesus. You all are here because of what Jesus did. Jesus had a powerful why. What is your why? Why do you do what you do? Do you know why you do what you do? It is my hope through these lessons on Shalom that this becomes your why. I am trying to sway you with my argument that I want Shalom to become a way for you to understand the Bible. I want it to be a way that you shape your understandings and the way that you view the world. And you say, I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of what God was doing in the Old Testament, what he sent Jesus to do, and now what Jesus calls us to do. I want to be a part of that. And I hope that your heart is moved by Jesus, by his why, by his purpose. So what about you? Why do you do what you do? Let's go to God and pray. Lord, you show us so many things in our lives that we have people all around us that we can look at and be inspired by. And we want to be people who are moved and inspired to follow you, to imitate you. But we want that same passion in our hearts. We want our hearts and our minds to be changed and transformed by you. I mean, isn't that what baptism is? It's me dying to the things that putting aside my why, and your why becomes my purpose. And so when I look at my calendar, Lord, and I think about why I prioritize the things I prioritize, what does it show? What does it point back to? When I look at the activities I do in my life, how I treat my wife, how I treat my kids, how I treat my coworkers, how I treat my community. Hopefully it is influenced and reflective of the why that you exemplified, and we can see it in your actions and your deeds, the way that you interacted with the poor, the Samaritans, the women, the Romans, the sinners, the tax collectors. May that become how we act. And may your heart be our heart as we read your parables, as we read your words, that we say, man, I want a world that's run by God. I don't want to live in a world of chaos. Man, I thought Jesus was just talking about be responsible. No, he's talking about living in a world run by God, designed by God. And I pray that that becomes our heart and our mission and our purpose, our why, Lord. And I pray that that becomes our church's why. I pray that we can be disciples and a family that really take this throughout our community, throughout Columbia, throughout South Carolina, throughout our country, and throughout the world, Lord. But thank you for your word. Please be with us. Please keep us safe as we are traveling back home tonight. But we love you, God. It is in your son's holy, holy name. Amen. Y'all have a great night.